Once upon a time, there was a thought. This was a thought that was complex. Well, it would be complex to you and me, hard to fathom. In fact, impossible to fathom. But to the one who thought the thought, it was really rather simple. Yet the detail of it was beyond our imaginations, our capabilities to grasp. And yet the mind of the one who thought the thought could understand it easily and comprehend it and grasp it all. And so in this thought, there was design, and in this design was a plan. And the plan was not to leave the thought simply a thought, but the plan was to let the thought become um, what we might call reality. Although it was reality even as a thought. But the desire of that one who thought it was to bring it into the realm of a creature, a creature that was a lot like him. In fact, part of the thought was to make a creature or creatures, many creatures, many millions of creatures who would be made in his image. And of course, when I say that, you know that the thought came from God. We understand that God knows all things. He sees things from the end to the beginning. So the thought was not the thought of a beginning. It was the thought of the end. It was the place that he would have bring this, if I would dare say, an experiment, although God doesn't really do experiments, but it was a plan, it was a design, and the design started at the end. He saw what he wanted. He saw what he wanted to accomplish. And so he thought that thought of the end, and in that thought, it goes moving, what we would say, backwards in time to a point called the beginning. And at that beginning point, that thought had, um, from our perspective, its origin, but from his perspective, the one that understood the complexity of the thought, it was really the end. It was the end. And all the ends of the thinking of this one who thought the thought is a glorious ending, because the glory is the end. The glory is his thought. And so he thinks this thought, and it is there. And, we don't comprehend the things like eternity. We don't comprehend things like the world beyond our physical world, that we march through this thing called time, and we march through this thing called space. But this thought was not bound by any of that. And it held the detail, of many things. In fact, it held the detail of all the things. And so this thought was there. And then it came a time when that thought was going to manifest itself. And it would begin to produce, again, what we would call a reality. But to the thinker of this thought, the reality was the thought. Okay, so we see there's a lot of thinking and a lot of planning, but there came this point in time when God allowed that thought to start moving forward in this thing that we call time. And as we begin to read his thoughts from the Word of God in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created. And what did he create? He began to create his thoughts. He started at the beginning of what? Not the beginning of God, because he has no beginning. It was the beginning of time. Now we begin to measure this progress of things, and we call it time. And so in the beginning of time, he made this creation. And God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. the beginning of time, but he really started at the end because he knew where he was going. Later on, as this began to develop and things happened the way that the thought had determined them to happen, there came a point in that line of time that is spoken of in the book of Galatians. It says, when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son. And here we have this introduction of the thought again. It comes the second time. The thought manifests itself in a different way. The book of John, chapter 1, starts like Genesis chapter 1. The first verse says, in the beginning of both of those books. In the beginning, God created. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and that word is not a word like we think a word, for a word is a means of communication. A word is a way to take a thought and transfer it from perhaps me to you or you to me. It's the vehicle that we use to transfer thoughts. But when John wrote and said, in the beginning was the Word, he used another term in the Greek language called the Logos. The Logos was the Word, but the word that we use in the English language is not the same as the Logos exactly. It's similar, but it's not exactly the same. It is like the thought and the expression. So is the origination and the expression of that origination is this Logos. And so the thought became, as John says in the 14th chapter of his writings in the 14th verse of the first chapter of John, he said, and the Word was made flesh. All that God is and all the thoughts and all the understandings was poured into this flesh that in its beginning was just a baby. And as that baby was born, all these thoughts were not in the mind, the physical brain of this child, for he was just like any other child. But all of those things were placed in the spirit of this baby, born in a manger, born, as some would say, on Christmas Day. No doubt it wasn't Christmas as we think of Christmas, but regardless of when it was, this child came and was born in a place called Bethlehem. And in him was all the thought, all the Word, all the Logos. The plan of God was in him. Somewhat perhaps an illustration like a seed that, though it be small, even perhaps the seed like a mustard seed, which is the smallest of seeds, Jesus said it's going to grow up into something. And so this seed, which is in the form now of a little baby child, doesn't know. That child had to learn. It had to learn to talk and to add and subtract and do all the things that any human being would do. But yet within the spirit of that child was, if we could say, like the seed. Inside the seed, there's a DNA, and that DNA has all the detail and all the design and all the plan of what that was to be. And so it was with this child, in the spirit of this baby born in Bethlehem, was the thought, the plan. It was made flesh. This thought from eons ago was made flesh, and God was bringing forth his design. And that design was not for just a nice story that we call the Christmas story, but it was about this child growing and about this child doing things and coming to a place where he would minister to people and he would heal them And he would even raise some from the dead. And he would cast out spirits that would come against humanity and try to bind and chain people in their dilemmas and in their sins. And he came to set them free, but the method that he came to set them free by was really unthinkable to you and I, because we struggle with life as individuals. We struggle with staying alive. But this thought was that this child, this flesh would come and he would do great things. But in the end, he would finally lay down his life. An unthinkable thought, and yet it was the thought that God had from the beginning. For the book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 8 tells us that he was slain from the foundation of the world, because that was the thought that God thought, along with all the detail of all the existence of all the people and of all the universe. It was all in the mind of this thought, or it was this thought. It was this Logos, and now this Logos has been placed in this human being that was indeed the body of God, God in flesh, Emmanuel, God with us. And he had a plan, and that plan was to give of himself, not partially, not somewhat, but give himself completely, for he did not come into this world. He was not born in Bethlehem to survive like you and I. We try to survive all our life long, and it comes to nothing, for in the end we die. But this one came not to survive, but this one came to die. And so it was that at the age of somewhere around 33, the plan of God played out perfectly. And the perfect plan was that he would be taken. And willingly, he went to a place called the place of the skull, Golgotha, Calvary, a place of crucifixion. And there they nailed him to a tree. And there the lifeblood flowed from him. And in agony he suffered and was tortured until finally the last breath of life came forth. And it was still that Logos being performed and played out. They took his body before dark because it was the Sabbath coming on, and they placed it in a borrowed tomb. And that tomb held him for a little while, but I wondered, did heaven and earth, all the spiritual beings, the angels, and perhaps demonic powers themselves, even Satan, did they look on to see what was going to happen? And so for 1 day, 2 days, he lay there like any other would lay in the grave. But on the third day, something happened, because on the third day, the glory of God, the glory of the Father, the finished product in a sense, comes in and raises this one from the dead. And in that resurrection, he defeats the power of all the enemy. For this was the thought of God from the beginning, to destroy the power of the enemy. But the story doesn't end there. We know that Jesus resurrected. We know the Word, or the Logos made flesh, came out of the tomb in resurrected form and in glory. And all the plans of God, in that way, they end in glory. But the plan of God is not finished, because it tells us that all the fullness of the Godhead was in him. That means all the plan, all the thought, all the understanding was in this man, Jesus. And then John tells us, and out of his fullness we have received. And so out of that same plan, the called of God have received our portion of that very same Logos. And we are called to do a thing. And this thing was thought eons of time ago, ages ago. God knew exactly what you and I were to accomplish. Enter in The promises of God are yea in him, and in him they are amen. In him he is the word. I'm saying today, enter in, not only just the study of the Bible, but enter into that Logos that he has literally shared with you. Oh, not that we are him, or not that we do his plan, but he has a plan for us. Part of that word from the beginning, that God thought that Logos included you and included me. The challenge is to live it, even as the Son of God lived it, by starting a life in a town in Judea called Bethlehem. And we celebrate it as Christmas. But the best celebration of this coming of the Logos is to step into that Logos and live it, even as he planned so long, long ago, when he had a thought. And his thought was indeed about you. Merry, Merry Christmas.